The air in the Wyoming frontier town of Pine Hollow carried the scent of dust, sweat, and desperation. Wagons rattled over uneven planks of the main street, their wheels grinding as merchants hawked goods to weary ranchers. The saloon swinging doors slapped open and shut, releasing bursts of laughter that held more cruelty than joy. It was in this atmosphere of survival, where compassion was a luxury and dignity often cost more than a man could pay, that a young woman's life was about to be sold. Mary Collins stood on the crude platform at the edge of town, her thin hands clutching at her swollen belly. She was barely 19, yet the lines of weariness on her face belonged to someone twice her age. Her dress, faded and patched in several places, could not conceal the shame her mother paraded before strangers. The crowd that gathered to watch was not entirely made of bidders. Some had come simply for the sport of it, eager to jeer at the sight of a pregnant girl being treated like a burden. Beside her, Mrs. Collins, hardened by poverty and years of bitterness, spoke with the sharpness of a blade. "She ain't worth much," she announced, voice dripping with disdain. "Pregnant and useless, just another mouth to feed. But strong enough to work a ranch, strong enough to cook and clean if a man can stomach the sight of her." The words fell like stones, and Mary flinched, though she had long grown used to them. She stared at the dusty planks beneath her bare feet, refusing to meet the eyes of the men in front of her. Some sneered, others whispered among themselves. Laughter rose from the saloon porch, cruel and cutting. Daniel Hartley had not planned to linger. He had ridden into Pine Hollow only for supplies, sacks of flour, nails for repairs, a coil of rope. He stood at the back of the crowd, broad-shouldered and weary-eyed, the brim of his hat pulled low against the morning sun. For years he had lived alone on his ranch, silence his only companion, since death claimed his wife. He had grown accustomed to that silence, though it gnawed at him like a slow disease. Yet something about the scene before him pierced the armor of indifference he had worn for so long. His gaze settled on Mary, not her shame, not her ragged dress, but the way she held herself against the cruelty surrounding her. Even beaten down by betrayal, there was a flicker of strength in her posture, a refusal to collapse though every reason for despair pressed upon her. Mrs. Collins tapped her foot impatiently, her arms crossed. $5, she barked. "She's worth at least that. Think of the work she'll do once the child's born." A man in a greasy vest chuckled. $2. That's all I'd pay for damaged goods." The crowd roared with laughter, but Daniel felt a surge of anger. Damaged goods, that was how they saw her. A girl abandoned by her own mother, stripped of dignity, reduced to a bargain. Mary closed her eyes at the words, as if retreating inward. Her lips moved faintly, but no sound came. It looked almost like prayer, though perhaps it was only a plea for the earth to swallow her. Before he realized what he was doing, Daniel's boots were moving forward through the crowd. The laughter dimmed as his shadow fell across the platform. His voice, deep and steady, cut through the jeers. "I'll pay the $2." Heads turned. Whispers spread quickly. Hartley, the widower. Buying a girl? Mrs. Collins raised an eyebrow, calculating. $2 then. She's yours. Daniel pulled the coins from his pocket, the weight of them suddenly heavier than any sum he had ever paid. He set them in the woman's palm without ceremony. Mrs. Collins closed her fingers greedily around the money, not sparing her daughter another glance. The transaction complete, the crowd dispersed with disappointed mutters, robbed of further spectacle. Daniel extended a hand to Mary, but she hesitated, her body tense. He did not push, simply waited. Slowly, as though expecting betrayal, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, trembling. "Come," he said quietly. They walked through the thinning crowd, the morning sun warming their backs. Behind them, Mrs. Collins already bargained with a peddler, coins clinking in her hand. Not once did she look at her daughter. Daniel led Mary to his horse, tethered outside the mercantile. She paused before mounting, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though she were stepping into exile. He adjusted the saddle blanket, offering the gentlest tone he could muster. "You'll be safe." Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Finally, she whispered words so faint he barely caught them. "Maybe this time, it will be different." Daniel did not ask what she meant, but the weight of her voice lingered. He mounted beside her, the leather creaking beneath his weight, and urged the horse forward. The town of Pine Hollow receded behind them, its laughter and cruelty fading into distance. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the stillness of his life shift. He had not gone to town in search of change. Yet beside him rode a girl cast aside by her own blood, carrying within her a child who had never asked for such a beginning. He wondered if perhaps fate had led him there, not for supplies, but for something neither of them had expected. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, the grass bending beneath the wind. Daniel glanced at Mary, her profile etched with both fear and a stubborn dignity. He did not know her story in full, but he understood one truth with startling clarity. The bargain made that morning was no ordinary trade. It was the beginning of something fragile, uncertain, and possibly miraculous. And as the horizon opened wide before them, Daniel Hartley could not shake the thought that the girl who had been sold like a burden might yet become the greatest gift his lonely life had ever received. The journey from Pine Hollow to the Hartley Ranch stretched across rolling prairies and scattered groves of pine, where the air smelled of resin and the wind sang low over tall grasses. Mary rode in silence, her hand pressed against the curve of her belly, the child within reminding her, with every flutter, that she was no longer only herself. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that flickered between weariness and a quiet sense of duty. Hours passed with only the creak of saddle leather and the steady beat of hooves against dry earth. Daniel was no stranger to silence. It had been his constant companion since the day he buried his wife. But this silence was different. It was fragile, like glass that might shatter if he spoke the wrong word. He longed to ask Mary about her past, yet he restrained himself, sensing that her wounds were too raw, her trust too brittle to bear questions. At last, the land dipped into a shallow valley, where a wooden house stood against the dark line of pines. The cabin was sturdy but carried the marks of years, logs weathered gray, shutters scarred by storms, and a roof patched more times than Daniel cared to remember. Behind it stretched the outbuildings of a working ranch, a barn with its doors yawning wide, corrals where horses shifted restlessly, and fields that bore the faint promise of spring. Mary's eyes lingered on the cabin as though trying to measure what sort of life awaited her inside. She had grown up with little more than cruelty, yet she had not forgotten how to hope, though hope often disguised itself as fear. Daniel dismounted first, steadying the reins before offering her a hand. She hesitated, glancing from his hand to his face. For a moment she seemed ready to refuse, to assert some fragile independence. But the weight of her body and the strain of pregnancy made pride a costly luxury. She let him help her down, her boots touching the soil of her new home. "This is it," Daniel said quietly. "The Hartley Ranch." Mary folded her arms around herself, shoulders hunched as though bracing against unseen winds. "It's quiet," she murmured. "Aye," Daniel admitted, his voice almost wistful. "Too quiet sometimes." He led her toward the cabin, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine smoke and dust. The single room stretched wide, partitioned only by curtains that marked off sleeping quarters. A large hearth dominated one wall, its stones blackened by years of fire. Shelves lined with jars and simple utensils spoke of a life stripped of ornament. Mary stood just inside the threshold, her eyes roaming the sparse furnishings. The silence pressed heavier here, as if the very walls carried the weight of loneliness. Daniel noticed her hesitation. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic, "but it's warm in winter, and it holds against storms." Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, then closed again. Words had always been dangerous in her world, often met with scorn or punishment. Daniel sensed her silence and did not force it. Instead, he set about kindling a fire in the hearth, the crackle of flames slowly easing the chill that clung to the room. When he finally turned back to her, he saw her standing near the window, fingers resting on the sill, gazing out at the pines. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, and a fading light painted her profile in hues of gold and sorrow. She looked like a ghost caught between worlds, half in the present, half trapped in a past that still clawed at her. "Mary," Daniel said gently, her name tasting new on his tongue. She turned, startled, as if unused to hearing her name spoken with kindness. "You'll have your own bed here," he continued. "I'll take the loft." "You don't have to," she began, but he lifted a hand, not in command but in reassurance. "I do," he said. "You've had enough of being treated as less than you are." Her throat tightened at the words, though she did not answer. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her as though she had value, not as a burden or a mistake. That night, the ranch settled into uneasy quiet. Daniel lay awake in the loft, staring at the wooden beams above, listening to the faint sound of Mary shifting restlessly in the bed below. He thought of his wife, Sarah, gone these 5 long years, her laughter now only an echo in memory. Guilt tugged at him, the old wound reopening. Was he betraying her by bringing another woman beneath this roof? Yet he also thought of Mary's trembling hand in his that morning, the way her eyes had carried both despair and defiance. He had not bought her to own her. He had bought her because something inside him, something he thought long dead, had stirred at the sight of her suffering. Perhaps it was mercy. Perhaps it was loneliness. Or perhaps, deep down, it was hope. In her room, Mary lay on her side, one hand curved protectively over her belly. The child within kicked softly, as if reminding her that she was not alone. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She feared this new life as much as she longed for it. She feared Daniel's kindness most of all, for she had learned that kindness was often a mask for cruelty. Yet something in his steady gaze unsettled that certainty. Could it be true that not all men saw her as a possession? The wind rattled against the shutters, the pines whispering outside like voices in the dark. Both Mary and Daniel drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, each haunted by shadows of the past. Morning broke clear and sharp, the sunlight spilling across the cabin floor. Daniel was already awake, chopping wood outside with measured strokes. Mary watched him through the window, the muscles in his arms straining with each swing, the rhythm steady, unyielding. There was a kind of strength in him that was not just physical. It was the strength of a man who bore grief, but did not let it break him. When he came inside, sweat streaking his brow, she quickly turned away, embarrassed to have been caught watching. He set the logs by the hearth and glanced at her briefly, then at the pot, simmering with water. "Can you cook?" he asked, his tone gentle, without accusation. Her voice was soft but steady. Yes. It was a simple word, yet it marked the beginning of something fragile. Participation, not command. Daniel nodded, stepping aside to let her move toward the fire. She knelt, stirring the pot with quiet competence, her movements slow but certain. For the first time, she was not being ordered or ridiculed. She was simply being allowed. And in that simple act, both of them felt a faint stirring of possibility. The ranch, long steeped in shadows of grief and silence, had welcomed a new presence. Neither knew whether it would bring healing or heartbreak, but as the scent of boiling oats filled the room and sunlight pierced through the dusty window panes, the first fragile threads of trust began to weave themselves between them. The ranch of shadows had taken in 2 wounded souls. Whether it would shelter them or consume them remained to be seen. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm, though one punctuated by unspoken questions and shadows neither Daniel nor Mary dared to confront directly. The Hartley Ranch, nestled in its valley of pines, seemed a world unto itself, a place where the clamor of townsfolk, the whispers of judgment, and the cruelties of the outside world could not intrude. Yet silence was not peace. It was a constant presence, a veil beneath which both carried their unhealed wounds. Mary spent her mornings tending to small tasks, sweeping the cabin floor, airing blankets, feeding the chickens Daniel kept near the barn. The work was familiar, and in its familiarity, she found a measure of comfort. But every movement was careful, measured, as though she feared overstepping the invisible boundary between survival and belonging. Daniel noticed her caution. He saw how she never sat without first glancing at him, as though seeking permission, and how she often startled at sudden noises. At night, he heard her soft cries muffled beneath the quilts. He did not press, for he knew that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. One evening, after supper, Daniel sat near the hearth, carving a block of pine into the shape of a bird. Mary lingered across the room, mending a tear in her dress. The fire cast shadows that danced across her face, softening the lines carved by hardship. She looked up suddenly, catching sight of the bird taking form beneath Daniel's knife. "You carve?" she asked, her voice tentative. Daniel glanced up, surprised. She had rarely initiated conversation. "I do. It keeps my hands busy when the nights get too long." He offered the unfinished bird across the table. She hesitated, then took it gently, as though it were something precious. Her thumb traced the curve of the wing. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel felt a warmth stir in his chest, a small spark breaking through the familiar weight of solitude. "It's not finished yet," he said softly. Mary's eyes lifted, meeting his. "Neither am I." The words hung in the air, fragile and raw. Daniel did not reply, but the fire crackled between them, filling the silence with a new kind of meaning. Not emptiness, but possibility. The ranch's isolation, however, did not shield them from the deeper storms within. Mary carried her child with growing heaviness, her body strained by both pregnancy and years of malnourishment. Some mornings she struggled to rise, her strength failing her. Daniel took notice, adjusting his chores to ease her burden, hauling water before dawn, chopping wood in larger stacks, even attempting to cook with clumsy hands. At first, Mary resisted his help, pride and fear twisting together. She had been taught that reliance invited disappointment, that kindness was only the first step toward betrayal. Yet Daniel's persistence was steady, unchanging, without expectation. Slowly, almost against her will, she allowed herself to accept. One night, as a storm rolled across the valley, thunder shaking the cabin walls, Mary woke with a cry. Daniel, descending from the loft, found her sitting on the edge of her bed, clutching her swollen belly. Her face was pale, drenched in sweat, her breath ragged. "What is it?" he asked, kneeling before her, his voice urgent but steady. "The baby," she gasped. "Something's wrong." Panic surged through him, but he forced it down. He remembered the night his wife had labored, her hand gripping his with desperate strength before fading into silence. The memory threatened to shatter him, but this was not the time to drown in grief. This was the time to fight. He built the fire higher, warmed water, and steadied her trembling body. Hours stretched in agonizing slowness, the storm outside echoing the storm within. Mary clung to him, her fingernails digging into his skin, her cries filling the small cabin. Daniel whispered encouragements, his voice breaking but refusing to fail her. At last, the cries were answered by another, the thin, piercing wail of a newborn child. Mary collapsed back onto the bed, tears streaking her face. Daniel, his hand shaking, held the tiny form swaddled in blankets. The child's cry filled the cabin, chasing away years of silence and shadow. "A girl," Daniel whispered, his voice reverent. "Mary, you have a daughter." Mary reached out, arms trembling, and he placed the child in her embrace. She cradled the infant as though afraid she might vanish if she loosened her grip. Her tears fell freely, mingling grief with awe. Daniel sat beside her, watching. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest until he could hardly breathe. He had thought his heart buried with his wife, thought that joy was a stranger he would never again welcome. But here, in this fragile, perfect instant, something broke open. The cabin was no longer filled with silence. It was filled with the sound of life, of promise, of a miracle. For days after the birth, Daniel remained near, tending to Mary and the child with a devotion that startled even him. He chopped wood with greater urgency, kept the fire burning warm, and prepared meals with care, though his skills were clumsy at best. When Mary slept, he watched over the infant, marveling at how such a small creature could carry so much hope. Mary, though weak, glowed with a new strength. She no longer looked like the shadow of a woman sold for a bargain. She looked like a mother, fierce and tender. The child's tiny fingers curled around her own, binding her to a purpose that no cruelty could steal. One evening, Daniel sat by the hearth, the infant nestled in his arms. Mary watched from the bed, her eyes soft, the firelight reflecting in them. "You saved us," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "No, Mary. You saved me." She smiled then, the first true smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. And in that moment, Daniel realized that the miracle was not just the child. It was the silence itself breaking, giving way to something new. But outside the valley, the world had not forgotten them. Whispers still traveled on the wind, carried by townsfolk who remembered Mary's disgrace and Daniel's solitude. There were those who would not forgive, who would see the child as a symbol of shame rather than blessing. For now, though, the cabin was a sanctuary. Within its walls, trust was being carved from silence, love born from brokenness. The miracle had come, but it was fragile. And as the pines whispered in the night, both Mary and Daniel knew that shadows still lingered at the edge of their peace. The first signs of spring crept slowly into the valley, softening the snowbanks into trickling streams and coaxing buds from the aspen trees. The ranch, long shrouded in silence and shadow, stirred with new life. Daniel noticed the change most keenly within the cabin, where the child's laughter, light, unsteady, yet radiant, had replaced the hollow echoes of loneliness. Mary named her daughter Hope. The name slipped from her lips with trembling certainty, a defiance against all the cruelty that had marked her past. Daniel had nodded in quiet approval, though the word had lodged in his chest with unexpected force. Hope. It was not just a child's name. It was a promise, a root taking hold in soil that had long been barren. Mary was no longer the timid figure who had stepped onto his land months before, uncertain whether she belonged. Her steps carried more confidence now. Her eyes held a light that had once been absent. Yet scars remained, visible not only in the haunted edges of her silence, but in the way she sometimes froze at distant noises, as though expecting her mother's harsh voice, or the cruel hand of fate, to reclaim her. Daniel, too, bore scars. Though he had welcomed the child's birth as a miracle, grief still shadowed him. At times, he would stand at the edge of the fields, hat in hand, staring into the horizon as if speaking silently to the wife he had buried. Mary noticed, but she did not press. Instead, she offered her quiet presence, knowing that some wounds healed not with words, but with shared silence. It was during those spring weeks that the whispers of the outside world finally reached their valley. A passing cattle drover brought news of Mary's mother, still bitter, still drunk, still railing in town about the daughter she had sold for a handful of coins. The drover spoke without malice, but his words carried an edge of curiosity, perhaps even judgment, as he eyed Mary with her child in arms. Mary shrank under the weight of his gaze, her old shame threatening to suffocate the fragile peace she had found. That night, she confessed to Daniel in a halting voice, "They will never let me forget. To them, I'll always be the girl who wasn't worth keeping." Daniel's reply came slow but steady, like the rhythm of his work-worn hands. "Let them talk, Mary. Out here, what matters is what we build, not what they say." Yet his words, though true, could not entirely erase her fear. She knew how swiftly the judgment of others could erode even the strongest foundations. The child was her joy, her proof of redemption, and she feared the world would brand hope as tainted by her own disgrace. One afternoon, while mending a fence line together, Daniel paused, leaning on his post driver. "Mary," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of unspoken thoughts, "I've been thinking." She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "About what?" "About names," he said. "Yours. Hope's. This ranch. Maybe it's time we claimed them." She frowned, uncertain. "Claimed them?" Daniel nodded. "The world can keep its stories, but we'll write our own. Folks in town, they'll always have their whispers. But if we stand together, if we build something lasting, they'll have no choice but to see us for who we are, not who they think we were." Mary studied him, her heart caught between fear and a fierce longing. She had spent her life being defined by others, by her mother's cruelty, by the shame of her sale, by the silence of survival. Could she truly carve a new name, a new root, in soil untainted by the past? That night, as the moon cast silver light over the valley, Mary sat by the hearth, holding Hope. Daniel sat across from her, carving another bird from pine. Without looking up, he said quietly, "We can be a family, Mary, not just by circumstance, but by choice." Her breath caught. The word family was one she had long ago abandoned as impossible. Yet here it was, offered not as a dream, but as a seed. "I don't know how," she whispered. "Neither do I," Daniel admitted. "But roots don't need to know where they're going. They just need soil and time." Mary's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, then looked across the fire at Daniel. "Then let's give her both." Spring melted into summer, and with it, the ranch flourished. Daniel taught Mary how to ride, how to mend tack, how to handle the cattle when storms scattered them across the meadow. She was quick to learn, though her laughter came slower, blossoming in bursts that startled even her. Hope grew strong, her cries turning to coos, her tiny hands reaching for both Daniel and Mary with equal trust. Often, Daniel would lift her high into the air, his rough hands steady beneath her small frame, his face softened with a joy that Mary had thought forever lost to him. The townsfolk, curious and skeptical, began to drift back into their lives. At first, their visits carried an edge, questions thinly veiled as kindness, glances that lingered too long. But when they saw Daniel's steady devotion, Mary's quiet strength, and the child's undeniable vitality, something shifted. The whispers grew softer, not vanishing entirely, but losing their sting. One Sunday, Daniel hitched the wagon and drove Mary and Hope into town. The stares came, as expected, but Daniel kept his head high, his hand steady on the reins. Mary, clutching her daughter close, felt her shame rise and then ebb, replaced by something stronger. By the time they reached the church doors, she realized she was walking not behind Daniel, but beside him. Inside, beneath the wooden beams and stained glass, the whispers fell silent. For the first time in her life, Mary felt she was not being judged but seen. As the seasons turned, the roots of their love deepened. It was not a love built on sudden passion, but on quiet endurance, on shared labor, on the unspoken promises made each dawn and kept each dusk. Daniel's grief did not vanish, nor did Mary's scars, but together they became something else. Scars transformed into strength. Grief transformed into gratitude. One evening, while the cicadas hummed and the pines whispered in the warm breeze, Mary stood on the porch watching Daniel cradle Hope in his arms. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his. "You once told me roots only need soil and time," she said softly. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And look what's growing." Mary leaned against him. Hope nestled between them. In that moment, the past no longer defined them, and the future stretched wide, not as a threat, but as a promise. The ranch, once a place of silence and shadows, had become a home, and within it, the roots of love had taken hold, fragile, perhaps, but unbreakable.